You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to Radio MMT. How are you, Anne?
Hello, Kev. Good to see you. And hello to our lovely listener. Thank you for being so intrepid to be wandering through the economy with us.
Look, last week we've been away for January, so did we have a repeat show last week?
We did. This is kind of our first real 2025 show.
Oh, wow. Our first show for the year. Because I was away at the tremendously excellent Lockhart Music Festival, which was the last one they're going to have. He's pulled the plug because he can't sell enough tickets, which is a real pity because it was an absolute gem of a festival. And
how many did he need to sell to break even?
Oh, look, I reckon he needed to sell about 1,500 tickets and he could only sell 1,000. And the year before was really good and we thought we could bounce off that, but it's just not happening. However, I am thinking of next year because it's in the country. It's down near Port Campbell. It's just near the 12 Apostles there.
Yeah, beautiful area.
Yeah, it's such a lovely site and everything's just terrific, just not enough punters. And he's having trouble pulling a crowd because I think he's relying on the Melbourne crowd and I think he needs to pull the local crowd. So I'm thinking of maybe turning it into the Lockhart Country Music Festival. So here we go.
Well, Kevin might turn into a festival operator.
Well, I don't know. Have you had a nice, relaxing January?
I have. And you know what? I had a visitor who is very into health and fitness.
Yeah.
And she took me off to our local swimming pool, which I have not been to for about 5 years.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why have I not been swimming in this pool? It's fantastic.
Ah, excellent. So you're swimming. Well, it's been quite warm. So that's what you and I have been up to for the last couple of weeks. What have we got on the program this week, Anne? What have you got for us?
Well, I thought this week that we would look into this wonderful world of digital money. What is going on with digital money and what would it mean if physical money was to go away?
Yeah, or if physical money had its digital equivalency. And I guess this goes into the clip that we're going to play with a fellow Rohan Grey who talks all about this.
Yes, thank goodness for Rohan Grey because he is terrific at helping us through this thicket of digital currencies and cryptocurrencies and e-cash and digital wallets and all of that stuff. And Rohan is a long-time activist, well known in the MMT community. He is a lawyer by trade, and he happened to grow up in Australia, but he is now Assistant Professor of Law at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, in the United States. And fortunately enough for us, Rohan's research focuses on the design and regulation of digital fiat currency. And each one of those three words could use an explanation. What is currency? And I think of it as a subset of money. So currency is essentially the money that is created by a nation state. And then what is fiat currency? It's like the nation state can create that money when it spends. So every time the federal government in Australia spends, it's creating Australian dollars. And then what is this digital fiat currency? And that's the part we're going to find out today.
Yeah, when we're talking about digital cash, there's a lot of transactions which are digital, but it was the whole concept of digital cash, something which is anonymous.
Well, let's have a listen then to our conversation with Rohan Grey. Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Rohan Grey to Radio MMT. Thanks for joining us today, Rohan.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Now, Rohan, you have quite the extensive and impressive bio, particularly when it comes to legal issues around money. So I'll just mention a couple of things. You work on the Digital Currency Global Initiative, a project of the United Nations International Telecommunications Union. And you are, of course, a co-founder of the Modern Money Network, which is a great resource that we'll link to for people to learn more about this stuff around money. And last but not least, you are Assistant Professor of Law at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. And Ron, I was a bit curious as to whether the fact that you're now living in the United States, whether that has anything to do with you pursuing your interest in monetary systems.
Yeah, I live in Portland, Oregon, actually, and my university is down in Salem, so I commute down.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, if you've saw anything about all the Trump sending the federal police into Oregon, it's an interesting ground zero for the coming civil war in American politics. But yeah, I've been in the United States for about 15 years. I was in New York for the bulk of it and got there through an exchange semester at the University of Pennsylvania, where a lot of my friends in the Debate Society went to Wharton Business School and ended up working on Wall Street. So, you know, the line that I like to say nowadays is, you know, if you grow up in the Roman Empire, where do you go but move to Rome? So that's sort of part of why I went there. And certainly the money has been a pretty big lens through which I've understood how the American empire and political system works.
Well, I'm certainly impressed at you throwing yourself into the belly of the beast there.
Yep.
Yeah, so I myself came to learn about modern monetary theory via the experience of long-term unemployment, because I was involved with the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, and that's where I encountered MMT. And that was also where I started hearing that we all want dollars because we all have to pay taxes in those same dollars. Now, as someone who was not earning enough to be taxed, Rohan, this sounded like a bit of a stretch to me. And it wasn't until I heard you give one of the best explanations for why we all potentially need dollars that I really came around to the MMT view of what drives the value of the currency, because we all want the dollars. Would you mind going over that connection between the law, after all, you are a professor of law, and the need we all have for the dollars?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. I think the first thing is, you know, even within the MMT discourse, the word taxes is always a bit of a shorthand. The sort of broader set of terms that the MMTs would use is taxes, fees, fines, and we've used the technical term in my small subset of the community of non-reciprocal hierarchically imposed obligations, right? Mm-hmm. That the public authorities get to say you have to pay and you don't get a choice about it. It's not a contract that you mutually agree and can walk away from. You know, it's not a marketplace where someone's got a price and you either like it or you don't. This is something by virtue of existing in a society have imposed onto you. But as a lawyer, I like to think of this almost as a sort of more subtle layer of it, that even if you don't have an affirmative obligation, right? Even if there's not an authority that, you know, conquers your land, puts a tax on you, or that you know, commit a crime and now you have to pay a fine or go to jail or something like that. But just by the very nature of existing in a society where there are property rights, there are contractual obligations, and even outside of contracts, I teach contracts, but even outside of contracts, there's torts. And my father is a barrister in Australia who was mostly a tort lawyer his entire life. It means that even if you don't mean to, even if you try to actively avoid interacting with other people, you might find yourself incurring legal liability. The example I use is you sort of walk down the street and you're not paying attention and you bump into somebody and then they fall over and hurt themselves. And the next minute, you know, you got a lawsuit. Or you go out into the middle of the woods and you find a piece of land and you prepay all your property taxes for 50 years and you're finally getting to, you know, live rogue, and somebody comes onto your land and trips over and they sue you for not having the right signage up. And, you know, even if you've got the right signage up, you're still paying legal fees. You know, you're still probably settling the court case for some small sum of money rather than sort of fighting it tooth and nail just to get an outcome that was more expensive than settlement. So I kind of describe it as a world of legal liability risk. And the word risk there is important because when we think of taxes and fees and fines, it's usually concrete. There's almost a number, there's a sort of hard amount that you can imagine. Well, what if I meet that amount? Or as you said, what if I'm unemployed and that amount is zero?
Mm-hmm.
But legal liability risk is more subtle than that. There's a percentage chance that you will have a $1 million liability or a $100 liability, and that those probabilities may be very small or slightly less small. But, if I said to somebody, hey, you've got a 40% chance of needing $100 this year, or a 4% chance of needing $100,000 this year, how many dollars would you like to feel secure? My guess is the answer is not zero, right? And if you extrapolate that up from the most libertarian out in the wilderness vision that I just gave of someone out in the woods to someone on a daily basis, right? They're driving their car around, they're going to shops, they're sending their kids to school. All these things could incur all sorts of liability risk. So in a world of ancient Egyptian, pharaohs where there's one tax every year, and other than that, you kind of get to live alone in the middle of nowhere, that world of legal liability risk may seem somewhat small or remote or not relatively prominent in your life. But in the modern world, the law is everywhere. Right? Legal liability risk is everywhere. It's a constant fog, however subtle. And that means that whether or not we want to, whether or not we try to avoid it, there is this sort of general anxiety that is only really alleviated by access to sufficient money.
So the point is that even if you think you can live outside the monetary system, you're very unlikely to be able to live outside the legal system, and therefore, whether you like it or not, you really do have to pay attention to needing money.
That's exactly right. And the fact that we are a colonial country hopefully makes that at least a little more stark, right? There are communities of Indigenous people here who probably would love nothing more than to have never had to have been disturbed by...
Kev will often point this one out. Yep.
It's an interesting example. You've got an entire Indigenous population happily looking after themselves for tens of thousands of years, and then one day a ship rolls up and everything changes.
Yeah, that's right. White European colonial settlers. And yet, today, part of the way that they can insulate or at least defend their way of life and their autonomy is to have enough money to not find themselves suddenly at the mercy of creditors and the taxman and the courts and whatever else. If you ask Indigenous people whether they'd like to have less money, I don't know how many of them would say, yeah, I'd like to light it on fire,
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
I did get interested in monetary systems as a result of getting into MMT, but I will say it's been quite confusing hearing about these new kinds of money, this new digital money that seems to have something to do with the fact that we're all living in the digital age. And so now we're hearing about central bank digital currencies or CBDCs. We're hearing about cryptocurrency, we're hearing about stable coins and digital wallets and e-cash and all these different things. And I suspect some of the confusion around digital money, it stems from the confusion about what money is, even before we throw in the digital part. And I suspect that a lot of people would not understand the difference between currency as issued by a federal government and bank credit as issued by commercial banks. And of course, the way I think of it is these are the two kinds of money that we mostly interact with on a day-to-day basis. So I thought it might be worth asking you to give us an overview of the monetary system as a whole, and that way we might be able to start sorting out how these new types of digital money are sitting within the monetary system.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's two sort of vectors that kind of confuse people or get sort of exponentially more complicated when they're combined. The first is the technology, because the technology is somewhat complicated. The law is obviously in an ongoing iterative relationship with technology, and so is money. But in my experience, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it can be very confusing and allows for a lot of grifters and things like that. But it's a double-edged sword also because it allows for a greater imagination. I spend a lot of time talking to law students, to politicians, to grassroots activists about money. And then when crypto comes along, suddenly you add the word tech in front of it. And people want to talk about philosophical first principles. People want to go back to, theories of money in a way that sounded hopelessly abstract when you were trying to talk about it in the context of MMT. So it was a door opening for some of us to get an MMT conversation back in. But the other vector is that the MMT story, which I always think is correct enough to have devoted a large part of my professional life and identity to it, is really about trying to be pedagogically useful to average people about the most important economic and monetary issues in their lives, which means it largely is a sort of line of best fit, right? You could spend your entire life becoming obsessed with money.
You can, I've discovered.
That's right. As somebody that's got the bug that went down the rabbit hole, I highly don't recommend it. If you've got a life, enjoy it, keep it.
Switch off now.
That's right. Hug your loved ones. Go listen to some music. No, but it is a line of best fit that begins with the sort of most important central nucleus of the monetary system, which is the public monetary system. And then secondarily, as you said, with the closest and most widely used forms of private money that have public recognition, which is bank credit. You can call it private in the sense of being driven by profit. But the reality is that there is a sort of hierarchy or a spectrum of money that goes all the way down to, you could say, you think about sort of, what is it, St. Peter saying wherever three people are, that's where a church is, like wherever three people are moving stuff around with numbers, you could say that's a sort of mini monetary system. Now, again, like most of the time in most social problems, that's not the level we care about. But Hyman Minsky, for example, would famously say anyone can create money. The challenge is to get it accepted. And to go back to the other conversation about the things that drive the value of money, right? The idea that public liability, public obligations drive money is in the sort of academic literature called the chartalist position. And when I did my first research around digital monetary systems, it was over a decade ago now. It was to do with mobile money in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And it was situations in which the existing financial system was relatively underdeveloped. They didn't have that much of a banking system, or people didn't use it very widely. And so what people ended up using was mobile airtime minutes. And it was a small technological innovation in places like Kenya, where what they did was they allowed people to transfer unspent airtime minutes from their prepaid card to somebody else's card. And the idea was that, like, if you're in a family and you've got some minutes, you can give it to a sibling or something. But people started using it as money. You could send it with a simple text message. And if you think of the chartalist story, why is that? Well, it's because you can pay your phone bill with it, right? How often is the tax man coming to your town? Not very often. How often do you have to pay your phone bill? Well, there's a cell phone tower everywhere across the country.
Once a month, yeah.
Exactly, quite like clockwork. Places like Haiti have very low tax collection rates and extremely high telecommunications penetration rates. So you saw this sort of development of not necessarily community money, but parallel systems of money that emerged out of things that had some degree of a chartalist logic. And so you can say on one hand, when we mostly think of money, we mostly think of public money or bank money. But we can also say that money is anything that a payment system does.
Right.
We can develop a payment system that does something that other payment systems don't or can't. Then that payment system will have some degree of moneyness that can kind of cause it to be relatively more or less prominent. And of course, the history of those mobile money systems is that over time, they started becoming more systemically important, which meant that central banks and governments started to be more worried about them. They started to integrate them. And of course, now most of those telecom companies have partnerships with banks. So it was a different entrance into the monetary world. It wasn't coming through the world of getting a legal license to become a bank. It was starting with doing something interesting technologically. So you already had the dollar or the Kenyan shilling or whatever it is, and you had to pay your airtime bill in that unit of account. And then it's just that we created an instrument or a sort of credit that was worth one of that. So it presupposes the unit of account, and it settles a debt.
Yeah, that's the counter argument to the barter myth.
Exactly.
The counter argument, which says that you have to have a unit of account first.
Yes, and cryptocurrency, depending on which currency you're talking about, sort of sits in a weird space sometimes between those things, right? Bitcoin isn't settling any debt. It's almost like a digital gold or digital real asset in that you're holding it and hoping it's worth something. People in the Bitcoin community like to say one Bitcoin is always worth one Bitcoin. Like, okay, one rotten potato is worth one rotten potato. The question is what that's worth relative to everything else. And in their view, eventually the entire government and society will collapse and everybody will only think in the unit of account of Bitcoin. But of course, the irony and the paradox of that is that they also continue to measure the success of Bitcoin in terms of its dollar value. Oh, Bitcoin got to $30,000. Oh, it got to $70,000. It got to $100,000. You know, they want to live outside the US dollar, but their imaginative space remains trapped within it.
What did you make of all that?
Okay, so now I'm just trying to interpret all this. This discussion, it prompts you to think about what is money and what is cash. And it goes back to thinking about what we're actually doing when we're exchanging this stuff we call money.
It takes us back to some of the basics, doesn't it?
What exactly is money?
And MMT has been telling us that whatever is accepted in payment of taxes, that's what gets accepted as money. That's the currency that the government is producing in these two forms. But then you can add technology into all of this, and that can influence what gets accepted as money. So he gave that really fascinating example of the mobile phone minutes in Kenya, because once they could tap each other's phones and just start transferring minutes, they started acting like money. So we might just wind back to the digital currency in terms of central banks.
Yeah.
And this is where I was also getting kind of confused, because with this talk of central bank digital currencies, like, my goodness, I thought that central banks were already issuing digital currencies, because over and over we hear the MMT economists tell us that central banks, like in Australia it's the RBA, they create money using a keyboard, and that sounds pretty digital to me.
Yes.
So I couldn't see, why we were all suddenly getting so excited about these CBDCs. So can you just explain what's happening that's new here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing is to note that the word currency is not obviously the same as the word money.
Professor Rohan Grey.
We often use them coextensively.
Right.
But the word currency really is derivative of the word current, and the word current was to do with the legal property of who owns it. If you have money in a spreadsheet, then it's the person who manages the spreadsheet that can sort of trace where the flows go. Oh, it went out from this account, it went into this account. And that means if somebody steals it or, commits fraud or something like that, then you can sort of trace it back. That's the flow of sort of account money. But money that you would hold in your hand, like cash, the idea was that it didn't have memory. And in the legal context, there was a thing called a bona fide purchaser rule, which meant that if you went and bought something with cash and the person who accepted your cash in good faith thought that you owned it, you couldn't go and take it back from them later, right? Say I rob a bank and the cops are chasing me and I'm in the middle of a car chase and I sort of, I lose them for a minute and I go into a convenience store and I get a refreshing Sprite and then I pay for it with one of the $5 bills that I just
As you
stolen.
might. Okay.
Yeah, I pay for it with a $5 bill I've just stolen and then I run out again. The cops sort of run in 5 minutes later and the guy goes, well, I'm not giving the $5 back, right? So I stole the money, right? You can still put me in jail if you catch me, but the $5 is gone. So cash is current in that the legal owner is whoever's in current physical possession of it. So when we talk about a digital currency, people often use it synonymously with money, but most forms of digital money, certainly most forms of bank money, certainly most forms of central bank money that are digital, have been account-based. You have to get an ID, you have to log in, they keep a spreadsheet.
Oh,
Creating a
okay.
form of digital currency that actually sort of sits in a physical wallet on your phone like a file. And if I move it around, it doesn't have a memory that goes back to central command. Has quite radically different properties. It has anonymity. It can be settled between people offline without access to the network, which is very important in wars or in hurricanes and things like that. So a digital currency that actually functions like physical currency as a bearer instrument where the legal ownership transfers to whoever's holding it in good faith is a very different thing.
Okay. So when we're talking about this new way of digitizing money, we'd already digitized the accounting style of money,
Yes.
or the money that's sitting in a ledger, but we hadn't digitized the cash, the physical cash. I finally get it. Thank you, Rowan.
Yes. And unfortunately, most of the central banks don't want to do that either. When they talk about central bank digital currency, a lot of them are doing it essentially under duress because they don't really want to innovate, but they're looking at all the stuff going on in crypto, and they're looking at the stuff going on in mobile money, and they're looking at Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg trying to get into the money game.
Yes.
And they're going, oh God, if we don't do something, then we're going to lose political power. We might lose sovereignty. You know, Facebook's not going to take over the US dollar tomorrow, but it could find a small country with, 200,000 people and take over its currency. And the next minute it's in the United Nations with a seat at the table. And that scares some central bankers.
Wow.
So the word central bank digital currency doesn't mean anything, except that whatever's going to happen in the future of digital money, the central bank's going to be in charge. Right? You can read dozens, and I have, unfortunately, dozens of papers from central banks where they say, what is central bank digital currency? We don't know. But we know we'll issue it.
Okay.
The keywords there are central bank, not digital currency.
I see.
And so half of them go, to your point, well, isn't this unnecessary because we already have an account system? To which other people say, well, that's wholesale. That's only available to banks and institutions. What if we gave it to average people? That would be different. So now we add a new nomenclature, which is wholesale central bank digital currency versus retail central bank digital currency. And retail central bank digital currency, you could also call that a public bank account or a postal service bank account.
Right.
But once you start doing that, it becomes very clear why central banks don't want it, because they're not in the business of actually serving average people. Like they're not postal workers. They don't want to. Have you been to the post office? They don't want to do that stuff. Like that's not. They don't want to deal with average people. They don't want to deal with bankers and numbers that have 3 commas in.
Right.
So for them, a retail central bank digital currency is like anathema. If you're in a country like Barbados and you've got 2 banks and half of those banks don't want to service a bunch of tiny islands, then yeah, sure, maybe you'll start considering a retail central bank digital currency. If you're in China and what you've done is basically let a couple of major financial technology companies like Alibaba and WeChat create their own form of retail payments, and you're about to sort of low-key nationalize them once they've done all the work of building the infrastructure, then yes, sure, you want a retail central bank digital currency because you're Xi Jinping and nobody is as powerful as you, even the founder of Alipay.
I was talking to someone who went to China recently. They said they couldn't operate there without having WeChat.
Absolutely. And Jack Ma, was making these sort of increasingly belligerent statements, and then he sort of disappeared for a re-education, has come back very chastened. But you watch what they did with the central bank digital currency there, and they waited. They waited for WeChat and Alipay to build cultural dominance about how to use payments. And then on the back end, they said, now you have to have an account at the central bank. Oh, now it has to be 50% backed by central bank dollars. Now it has to be 100% backed by central dollars. Actually, the dollars in your pipes, they're central bank dollars now, right? That's the sort of sequencing that it's doing there. So it's different by each country. But if you think about a central bank digital currency as 3 potential options: wholesale, which we already got. So yes, what's new there? Nothing. It's really just rebranding. Retail, which would be new, but it's a little too close to socialism, and we really, really don't want to do that unless we're actually socialists.
What would that look like for the average Joe? Is that like where you would actually have an account that's at the central bank?
You would have an account at central bank. Most countries that didn't want to go full socialist, what would probably happen is it would be like a wrapper with your regular bank, so that it would just be a vanilla checking account at your regular bank. And they would be required to provide it as a service, like they provide cash. And so they would say, would you like to have access to your government super vanilla account, okay, and then they would, make the app not work very well, and they would constantly try to entice you over to their deposit account. Well, if you switch your, money over to us, we'll give you 4% returns, and
Switch now.
yeah, that's right. Get extra points on your credit card and whatever else it is, right? So they will do everything they can to make it undesirable. Or if you go to countries with postal banking, which already exist, then they work. Up until the point you have someone like Trump try to privatize the postal service, or the Republican Party conduct a 15-year war by forcing it to pre-fund its worker pensions out 50 years and then say, look, it's losing money. Not that the postal service needs to make money anyway, but it's a good excuse to then say that it's unsustainable.
All this elasticity just reminds me of how money is a creature of the law. You make up the rules and you can change things in all sorts of different ways.
And it's technologically different, right? That last third option is that digital cash idea. And that is genuinely revolutionary. But of course, the problem with that is that it's privacy respecting. And in fact, most central bankers don't even really like cash and coins. It's a little lowbrow. It's a little retail. And you know who uses cash? Criminals. Drug dealers, terrorists. Yeah, maybe some political dissidents, but we also don't really like those, do we? Right? Pro-Palestinian activists? Absolutely not. Sex workers? Oh, God. So on one hand, the public loves privacy. On the other, central bankers get a call from the spooks, and they're not going to say, no, I'm a civil libertarian. Let me stand up to you. I mean, this is not why these people got PhDs in macroeconomic statistical modeling. So they're not in the biz to be freedom fighters.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
We're talking about what we call CBDCs,
Central Bank Digital Currency.
And I thought we already had that, because I thought digital transactions and digital stuff.
So did I.
Yeah, I thought what are we talking about here? So we're not talking about transferring funds from one account to another digitally. We're talking about like a peer-to-peer thing where we tap phones and there's an exchange of numbers, which is equivalent to the exchange of cash without a record. With anonymity.
It's anonymous.
Yep.
It's the digital equivalent of me pulling a $20 note out of my wallet and handing it to you. No one else needs to know that I gave you that $20.
So we're talking about the digitisation of cash and coins.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, why is that important? And I guess that's what we can go into.
But the new thing that we've both sort of woken up to here is taken from this understanding that the central bank is the institution that issues currency on behalf of the federal government when it wants to spend. So I think of it as like the federal government's giant cash register.
Yep.
And it does that in two forms. In one form it's a purely digital form. It's an accounting-based form, and it's just like a record. It's like a spreadsheet in a computer.
A ledger.
Yeah. So we know who's got what money and where it's transferring to and so forth. And so that's been digitised for quite some time. But we haven't digitised the notes, the humble note and the humble dollar coin. We haven't digitised those yet, but that technology is coming down the pipeline.
It does sound kind of strange to me to have these transactions which aren't recorded, etc. And that's because I've become quite kind of card orientated as opposed to cash orientated. And it sounds a bit weird, but you have to remember that the way we operate now is quite new and different to how it was 20, 30 years ago when everything was done in cash or checks. So that certainly if you wanted a record of the transaction, then a check would serve that purpose, because a check would be...
It was a bit closer to the accounting ledger type of money, wasn't it?
But cash used to be quite common. So it's not a strange concept. This is how we used to operate. It's quite common.
Yeah, only about 3% of the money currently in circulation is physical money. But as we'll see in the next clip, it's something that we don't want to go away, even though there's so little of it being used. So there's this physical version of money and there's this non-physical or digital version of money. Rohan's story about robbing the bank reminded us that the digital money behaves very differently from physical money. So physical money is owned by whoever's holding it. So in this new world of digital cash, I'm imagining if your card gets stolen, it's just like losing a $20 note. Whoever's holding it now owns it.
Yeah, it's kind of like having a scratchy or something, isn't it? Yeah.
And the other thing is that when we do create a digital version of these, these humble notes and coins, it's not just a technological problem, but it's also a political problem, because digital cash opens up the possibility that the population can interact with each other without the intermediary of these commercial banks and intermediaries like Visa and PayPal and all of those. I can imagine that these are quite strong lobbies out there who are saying, well, we want our cut.
Yeah.
We don't want people interacting digitally without us, because at the moment, for every digital transaction, they are taking a percentage.
But as we've seen, regulatory authorities, they prefer to have everything recorded. They want to know where you've been and who you've been interacting with. And commercial entities want the same thing. They want to mine all that information so that they can direct you
That's
to spend your money with them. And
there's a lot of data harvesting that can go on there. That's why they like it. So you would think that commercial banks don't like dealing with the unwashed masses, because you look at all those branch closures that are happening at the moment, where small towns around Australia are being left without a branch.
Yeah.
But the thing is, what they don't like is the in-person transactions. They love the digital transactions because that's where they make a profit.
Yeah, and so the question is, like, if the banks don't want to have to deal with this cash stuff, and the governments don't want to have to
That's
introduce,
right. What are we left with?
Who does want this, and what's the reason for it?
And that's why I think money needs to be thought of as like a public utility, like electricity. It's something that everybody in this day and age needs. And so I do have those socialist tendencies that Rohan was mentioning. And so I would like to see this retail banking by the central bank, or what we might call a public banking option. Now, as Rohan was describing, it might not be the central bank itself that you would interact with. They might franchise that out to the commercial banks. Yeah. But I would like to see the central banks take on that role.
Yeah, I'm wondering what parallels this draws with the Labor government that fell over in 1948 when they wanted to nationalise the banks, if there's any at all. There seems to be an efficiency in having a central government-controlled bank, because the commercial banks are there to make profit.
Well, we should at least have a public option, and it's like the job guarantee, a public option for a job, because it'll set the minimum standard of services and what to expect, and then the private sector needs to compete with that and add something better.
Yeah, I guess actually when you think about it, if it was a central bank doing it, they're not concerned with the profit line. They're concerned with the function.
Yeah. In the next segment from Rohan, we will hear more about what crypto can and can't do, and we'll hear about what digital cash can and can't do. So shall we have another listen to our conversation with Rohan Grey? So what you're saying is the new technology does have the possibility to give us a digital version of cash which guarantees privacy of transactions between actors.
Yeah.
Professor Rohan Grey.
And if you think about the broader problems with the current state of the internet, where every website is mining your data, and that, every single thing you've ever thought or done or tried to buy online is all going in some big digital profile that the government is keeping tabs on everybody, then, without the money layer being anonymous, the rest of the internet isn't anonymous. And so, on one hand, it is the tip of the spear of a very, very different vision of how we could all be digitally connected to each other all the time, without Big Brother in the middle of it, reading our hopes and dreams and fears and everything.
That's the potential of a digital currency.
That's the potential, and it's also precisely why it's so dangerous. And of course, that's also what all of these crypto-libertarian people try to claim. They say, this is what we're doing. We're trying to build an anti-government. You don't want state totalitarianism. The average person's like, yeah, I don't. Like, that doesn't sound great. They say, well, we're the only ones that care. Have you tried digital gold? Have you tried Austrian economics? And you go, well, wait a second. You had me at privacy, but now, this isn't what I wanted. And so there's this unfortunate conflation of the technological benefits of cash, which often, by the way, these crypto technologies can't even actually replicate, with the politics of libertarian hard money. And so it's sort of like, do you want pro-privacy at the cost of a ridiculous right-wing monetary system? Or do you want a sound fiat monetary system at the cost of surveillance all the time? And to me, there's a third way. There's something else, which is we already have fiat cash.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that it's very hard to relitigate that at a time when there is a sort of slow drip, drip, drip war of attrition against cash.
So you're talking about the physical notes and coins.
Yeah. And see, the thing is, when you talk about government digital cash, it's not bad money. It's in the way that libertarian money is bad money. It doesn't cause booms and busts. It doesn't go fluctuate in value. $1 always pays $1 of taxes. It's as good as the greenback in your pocket. So it's sound as a monetary theory. The challenge is technological. Whereas with the crypto people, at least some of them, the most principled and the least grifter, which is a small fraction of the community. It's that old joke, like 98% of the lawyers give the rest a bad name. But it's the crypto community tries to create a privacy-respecting digital currency, but because they don't have a central trusted government, they end up trying to do so on the basis of a theory of money where money comes out of barter or comes out of markets. And so then you end up having crypto mining that uses a huge amount of electricity, or Ethereum moving to what they call proof of stake, which basically means we're going to trust a certain key group of actors in the community to tell us whether or not anybody is committing fraud. And the reason we trust those people is because they've got a lot of money riding in the system, which I think is essentially property owning democracy logic. It's the idea in early Americas or ancient Athens where only the people who have property and land get to vote because they're the only ones who really want to keep the system running.
I wonder if I'm understanding the technology. If central bank digital currencies could end up using that huge amount of energy that the cryptocurrency notoriously does. And I'm not sure, has that use of energy got to do with the fact that they're sitting on this thing called blockchain? And would central banks be using blockchain technology?
Well, yeah, I teach a whole class on law money technology, so how much time do you have?
Yeah.
No. But the truth is, the answer is no, it doesn't have to at all.
Right.
Part of the reason why you end up with such energy costs in something like Bitcoin is essentially precisely to try to have an integrity to the system without having a central issuer. The way you make sure that the Australian dollar or the US dollar has integrity is you have a secret service and you have counterfeiting in the currency, and you have a signature by the Treasury Secretary on the bottom of the currency that says, I promise to accept this back in payment of taxes and any other legal liability.
I feel like the problem the crypto people are trying to solve is how do you transact between two people, and how do you keep that transaction anonymous without a third bigger person looking over each person's shoulder to make sure you're honestly transacting.
Yeah, it's less even about anonymity as much as it is about double spending. How do you make sure that I don't go to a photocopier and photocopy my $100 bill and give it to two people? Because part of the problem of digital is it's all bit streams, and bit streams can be Control-C, Control-V. And the way that you avoid Control-C, Control-V with a government digital currency is that the government controls the balance sheet, or it controls the hardware. It makes the paper or the notes, or it's actually the Australian government that pioneered polymer plastic currency for the rest of the world.
So that counterfeiting thing is a big
deal, but nobody's paying the counterfeiting division of Bitcoin. Of course, there's nobody in charge. So what you end up having is essentially an extremely elaborate anti-spam device where everybody says we think this is the consensus, and if we all vote, then we all agree. But the problem with that is, how do you make sure there's not spam voting? How do you make sure I don't come in with 100 ballots and stuff the ballot box? And the answer is, we'll make you solve a complicated Sudoku before you go into the ballot box on election day. And that complicated Sudoku takes up computing power. And the idea is, well, you wouldn't want to waste computing power. Or at least if you did want to waste it, hopefully the amount that we're going to make you waste is so much that it's not worth it for the counterfeiting that you'll be able to do on the back end. And so you end up having this hugely wasteful system where every time we want to process a set of transactions, every single member of the community that is trying to sort of put their thumbs up or thumbs down in the town hall to say we think this is a legitimate transaction is all furiously solving Sudokus that are just a waste of time. They don't do anything. They're just all there to stop the one person spamming the whole thing.
I love that image. That tells you why crypto is just so top heavy.
Yeah, so you either get a world where you have to trust a central intermediary, or you get a world where you have to find some way of preventing spam by increasing the transactional costs.
And so in trusting this central entity, is there a way to trust them then? Is there a way to trust that if we go for central bank digital currency, we're not all going to have Big Brother watching everything we do?
Well, see, that's the thing, right? You have to trust them not to inflate the currency and to cause hyperinflation and to not mess up the monetary system itself. All of that on like the monetary policy side. And that's the stuff the libertarians in the crypto world already hated, right? They were already libertarians. They were already run poor people. They already said, I don't like the government. Everything we've done since the 30s where we had healthcare and public education, I hate all that stuff, right? So for them, they would prefer the kind of 19th century Wild West free market where everybody's in a Deadwood episode. Than a world of social welfare and public institutions. So they hate not the technology side. They don't hate the privacy issue. They hate the socialism issue, right? But if the question is, can a government create a fiat currency that, putting aside all the questions of monetary stability, can it actually protect privacy? Even though at the same time, a government has a very clear set of structural incentives to surveil everybody, right? You ask the cops how much information they want on people, the answer is more. You ask the spooks how much information they want, the answer is all of it. So there are segments of the government that will always have a structural interest in undermining civil liberties and privacy. They always have. But the question of whether or not we can build a functioning society where that's not the overarching and only dimension of government force, the answer is yes. And we know that because we have had cash for millennia. Governments hate it, right? Governments hate it. Briefcases full of cash in every propaganda movie. But it exists. So the question is, what would it take to have a social political movement that says we do like public money? We like, Keynesian economics in the most basic sense, even if we're not all the way to a job guarantee. We like a world where we don't have massive rolling depressions that we can't solve every few years. We like a world where we can have, basic social welfare institutions.
Full employment.
Yeah, full employment, public spending on good things.
Universal basic services, one thing we always talk about here.
Exactly. So we can have that world, and we can have the money that makes that world go round. Not spy on you all the time, not be a bloody snitch, because we've lived it. We've lived it. We had cash for a long time. Now, the challenge of doing that as we enter the digital world has been the challenge of my professional career and my doctoral work, etc. And it's a challenge that is not unique to money. It's a challenge for things like end-to-end encrypted communications on the internet. A debate you're hearing in the United Kingdom and Europe right now about whether or not they can force companies like Signal or Element, who have built end-to-end encrypted communications platforms with open source software that you can host on your own computer server at home, that whether or not they can force the programmers to build backdoors. It's the debate about whether or not we can have a net nanny. We're regulating the entire internet in a country. The most recent one in Australia, of course, is the debate over banning children from social media. And whatever you think about the merits of kids going on social media, right? And it's notable that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't let his kids on his own bloody platform. Whatever you think about the merits of that, what that actually is, in my opinion, underneath all of that rhetoric about saving the children, oh my God, think of the children. And I was a literal attorney for children in New York and worked in elementary schools. So I can say that with some cynicism. I do actually care about children.
Yes.
But underneath all of that pearl clutching and hand-wringing about caring for the children, in order to be able to ban children from social media, you need to know whether or not the people on social media are in fact children, which means you need to start having some form of digital identification system that you impose onto those apps and platforms. And once you start doing that, you've already killed anonymity. Even if you let the adults back on, you now know they're adults, which means you now know who they are, which means you now know where to find.
There's trade-offs in all of this.
There is trade-offs. And again, it's not like I want to be sanguine about all of the harms of, child sex traffickers and everything else. But the right to have private thoughts, the right to communicate with other people without somebody listening in, the right to engage in economic interactions with other people that involve money without having to ask permission from Big Brother are fundamental aspects of a free society that we have had for a long time and we are right on the cusp of losing.
Wow. And I think a lot of people don't realise how important this is as part of our rights and how close we are to losing. I think a lot of people aren't aware that this is a potential issue to get active around.
Absolutely. And I can say all of that while being extremely skeptical about crypto. And extremely skeptical about whether crypto even achieves those things or even could achieve those things if it wasn't primarily a tool of grift, which I think it is. But that's why the MMT analysis is so important, in my opinion, because it shows us that the fight needs to take place on the terrain of public money,
right?
Not crypto, right? It refutes the libertarian BS and why the MMT community needs to take digital currency technology more seriously, because there's no point having a job guarantee if the job guarantee is a surveillance nightmare. There's no point paying people to do things and having a just public monetary system if the whole thing is in the thrall of the NSA.
And so we are still talking about the need to retain the physical form, or are we talking about
both that and digital, right? My colleague Brett Scott, who has an amazing book called Cloud Money, and I think it's one of the best expressions of these concerns. He's a wonderful communicator and a great educator as well. But he likes to talk about physical cash as it's like the staircase in a high-rise building. You want to use the elevators, but if the elevators break, you're very, very grateful there's a set of stairs. Or he describes it as like a bicycle as opposed to a car. It's nimble. You can't run out of fuel,
Right.
So physical cash is incredibly important. Protecting physical cash is a huge part of defending against the war on cash and the war against financial and monetary privacy. But as we go into a digital world, more and more parts of our lives are online. And so how we can successfully import the values and functionality of physical cash as much as possible into a digital world. So things like having the equivalent of like a transit card that stores value on it that you can tap, or having it built into a phone chip, while also making sure that it's difficult enough to counterfeit, that you don't have a complete collapse in the monetary system, right? The Civil War, when they wanted to attack Confederates, one of the ways the Union did it was that they printed a bunch of Confederate dollars to basically mess up the Confederate monetary system. I mean, I have no sympathy for the slave-owning Confederacy, but there will always be some degree of counterfeiting. But it is important through a combination of technological, cryptographic and other forms of security, and through legal regulation to keep that level of counterfeiting within an acceptable boundary so that it does not destabilize the entire monetary system.
The thing is with this, you end up talking about cryptocurrencies, unfortunately. And as Rohan was pointing out, the dollar coin, it's much more efficient at protecting your privacy and at preventing counterfeiting than crypto ever will be, with those masses of energy that it's using in order to solve these puzzles, in order to create these bitcoins.
When we hear about cryptocurrencies, crypto is not currency. Crypto.
They've stolen the name.
Okay, so crypto it's a commodity. It's not a regular means of payment.
No.
It's a purely speculative thing. You could speculate on all sorts of stuff: gold, oil, wheat, tulips.
Tulips. You say crypto, I say tulips.
Yeah. So the other thing about crypto, like crypto in particular, is that it's a finite resource. There's only a certain amount of crypto dollars.
Yes.
I think there's different schemes.
That's why it's like gold in that sense.
And that's what makes it adjust its value. Money is infinite. Money can be constantly created on demand.
Interestingly, back in December 2024, Jim Chalmers was making some positive, if rather vague, noises about cryptocurrencies. He was quoted as saying, "I think crypto has a role to play and it's part of modernising and innovating in our financial system." I guess he was signaling some kind of pacification of the incoming regime in America. But I think Michael West of Michael West Media said it best when he said, FFS, Jim. Crypto only has three purposes: criminal payments, unproductive speculation, and undermining the financial system. Oh, okay, maybe four uses if you think feeding conspiracy theories is a use.
Yeah, and I like your tulip analogy. You may as well say tulips. If you want to start dealing in tulips, it's the same thing. You've got to.
I mean, I think the incoming US president has promised to become the crypto president. So for a while, they're going to be able to support that crazy value of bitcoins and whatever else. But
like as is mentioned, crypto is measured against a dollar, which is set by the government. No unit of account, no crypto. So it needs a currency. It needs a monetary system for it to exist.
Exactly. In fact, I was thinking about the standard understanding of what money does. So not what money is, but what it does. And there are these three ideas, which is that it's a store of value so that at some time in the future you can use it to buy something. It's a means of payment. And so crypto does both of those things, but it's not a unit of account. In other words, when people think about how do you measure the value of crypto, they go back to dollars in order to think about what is the value of crypto. Crypto itself is not being used to measure dollars. So at the moment, the dollar rules.
Yeah, you only know what a crypto is worth if you have a dollar to translate it to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In that war on cash issue, I was just wondering, would you be a proponent of requiring businesses to accept physical cash as legal tender?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There's been moves in Philadelphia and New York and elsewhere for that. I think it was actually part of the most recent set of parliamentary reforms here as well when they were doing other things. Because, the way that they frame it, and again, Brett does a great job characterizing this, people frame it as being cashless, but it's also being bank full. Is what it is. Right? Visa gets to be there. It's a class issue. A lot of poor people use cash more than others. It's an age issue. A lot of elderly people, people who are undocumented in the United States use cash more because they can't get bank accounts. So saying we don't accept cash, it sounds very cool at your bougie cafe where you're getting your latte and your avocado toast. It's sort of part of the, I have my Apple computer and I sit there with my Beats headphones and I work on creative economy stuff, and we don't take cash here, and cash is dirty. We're clean, and it's
with the COVID pandemic.
Yes, even though the World Health Organization said very clearly that there was no evidence that cash was a vector.
There is no evidence that we're spreading viruses via cash. Thank you.
That's right. They said that there was no evidence that it was a vector, but of course that's not going to stop Visa and PayPal and the Bill Gates Foundation pushing mobile money in sub-Saharan Africa. I say to my students when I teach this stuff, beware missionaries bringing Bibles and beware billionaire tech moguls bringing mobile phones.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rohan. You've actually validated the unease I have about the disappearance of physical cash. And I'm going to be maybe more assertive when I can feel the line at the counter building up behind me because I'm rummaging around in my bag trying to find the exact change.
Yeah, that's right. You're standing up for people's civil liberties and they'll thank you in a generation. I had a law professor who said they killed dozens of his family members in the Holocaust. And next time they'll get every single one because they'll know everywhere everybody is all the time. That's what stuck with me. This isn't just an abstract issue. This isn't just an issue about buying sex toys on the internet. This is about whether or not you can organize dissent against fascism without them catching everybody and killing them. It's important. And from an MMT point of view, we don't have to all suddenly, become crypto pilled to understand that fiat money is a more stable form of monetary system than gold, commodity, libertarian market money. And that something that can work offline, that can settle a transaction peer-to-peer without resorting to third-party account validation, like cash, is important. So that's the technological side of it, right? MMT's got the legal economic theory of money. The technological side is it needs to be based in the device, whether it's a piece of paper, a metal circle, or a computer chip. And it needs to work between two people without anybody else in the room.
Yes.
I remember when I started, like a lot of people, you hear about something like privacy and finance, and you say, well, if I'm not doing anything wrong, what do I care? And to get from that to, if I'm not doing anything wrong, I have a right to resist. And if I'm not doing anything wrong, I have a responsibility to help everybody resist, because this is an ecological issue, not a personal issue. Those are the kinds of ways that if we can collectively move ourselves to think of, this is as much an environmental issue as picking up rubbish on the street.
Well, thank you, Rohan. You've really managed to clear up some of the confusion that I think is more or less deliberately propagated around this issue. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Kevin, I recently, in my newfound swimming career, found a use for cash.
Yeah.
Because the local pool is doing $2 swims at the moment. So all I have to put in my bag are my goggles and my $2 coin, and I'm good to go.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But there are some pools that don't take cash, as I discovered. And so I rocked up to this other pool and they wanted me to have a card with me. And I'm thinking, what's the point when they say don't take valuables with you to the pool? What's the point when they make you take your bank card?
You've got to take a valuable with you, yeah. I'm just sort of thinking about it. I've been in two minds about this. It's sort of like, yeah. But now I'm sort of thinking about it, and I think if you can maintain this anonymity, then it's a good thing.
Yeah, it's one of the last bastions of true anonymity is the good old dollar coin.
And I'm just sort of getting it in my head. It's kind of like a Bluetooth application where I can connect my speaker to my phone, and not everybody needs to know that. Not everybody needs to know what I'm listening to, etc.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation with Rohan. He is to me what applied MMT looks like when it's done with real humanity and a very versatile imagination. So that was a great conversation to start dipping our toes into the water of digital currencies. And I think in the future we'll have to look more at this war on cash.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder whether it's the responsibility of a monetary system to counteract that monitoring, whether that should be a regulated thing. I mean, could you have money and could you have regulations that give you privacy? But as we've seen, governments counter to produce that kind of outcome because they want to know what you're doing.
Exactly, which is why, we need a democracy that will create the laws that will say when we have central bank digital e-cash that it can't be used to monitor.
Yeah, but then if you go back in the history, and having read that book, Grey with the 5,000 Years, etc., a lot of the time transactions were all records and there was very little anonymous cash around. They were done with tally sticks and ledgers, etc., during stable times, and money like cash was used during unstable times.
But the more we monetize our society, as in the more things that are being able to be bought and sold with money, the more the importance of anonymity becomes. So back in the days of tally sticks, most people weren't actually buying their daily needs with money. They were living within a kinship system where you had mutual obligations to do things for each other.
Yeah, true. This is a discussion that could take quite some time, Anne, and we don't have time to have this discussion because Vicky is standing by to come up with Mafalda very soon. We'll catch you again in a couple of weeks. See you later.
See you then. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org. educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listening listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational
I
expectations.
think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.